Since independence, Guyana has been neglected and arguably dysfunctional, a product of the European Empire's transportation of hundreds of thousands of people from Africa and Asia to the coast of South America to grow sugar. But that might be about to change. In 2015, Exxonmobil announced that it had struck oil off the coast of Guyana. Since then, it has discovered 1.7 billion barrels of oil every year in a country of only 800,000 people. This video is about everything you need to know to understand Guyana today.
These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present.
In previous videos, we have looked at how Guyana was shaped by its colonial experience, and then its years as a flamboyant tropical dictatorship. In short, what is now Guyana was a colony first of the Dutch and then the British, who came here looking for profits and turned this stretch of coast into one continuous strip of plantations, all in service of one sweet commodity: sugar. Pushing the Amerindians back into the hinterland, they imported hundreds of thousands of African slaves across the Atlantic. And then, when slavery was abolished, hundreds of thousands more indentured laborers from India. At independence, these Indo-Guyanese substantially outnumbered the Afro-Guyanese. The problem was, in Guyana's about-to-be-born democracy, the British and Americans were suspicious of the far-left politics of the party representing the Indo-Guyanese, the PPP. So they helped to install their rival, the PNC, the party mainly representing Afro-Guyanese, under the leadership of Lyndon Forbes Burnham. For 20 years, he ran Guyana as a dictatorship, mostly for the benefit of the Afro-Guyanese, meddling in African liberation movements and, despite having the West to thank for coming to power, allying with the Soviets, Cubans, and North Koreans. He banned the import of almost everything and pushed Guyana into poverty. It was during his rule that almost 1,000 Americans of the cult, the People's Temple, came down here, hacked a commune called Jonestown out of the jungle, and then committed mass suicide. Then, in 1985, Burnham died. How we got from there to here, with Guyana's great oil bonanza about to come online, is the subject of this video. So before we start out on the story of modern Guyana, let's get a general picture of the country as it is today. Guyana, or officially the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, is small. It has about 800,000 people, slightly bigger than Seattle but smaller than San Francisco. Georgetown, its capital city, is officially a little over 100,000 people, although in my experience it feels a lot bigger. Linden, its second city, doesn't even break 30,000. Geographically, Guyana has 4 natural regions. The first is the narrow and fertile marshy plain formed by mud that is swept out to sea by the Amazon River and deposited on the Guyanese shore, where 90% of Guyana's population lives. Then there is a white sand belt further inland where most of Guyana's mineral deposits of bauxite, gold, and diamonds come from. And then the dense rainforests that cover most of the country. Last is the small patch of savanna down in the southwest. Guyana has no well-defined shoreline or sandy beaches. Without a natural harbour, the sandbars and shallow waters are an obstacle to shipping. Incoming vessels often have to unload their cargoes onto smaller boats to reach the docks at Georgetown and New Amsterdam. On top of that, navigation by rivers is limited because of waterfalls and rapids, so there are no easy ways to access the interior. This has severely limited Guyana's development, as has the fact that any land needs massive drainage work. A square kilometre of sugar plantation, for example, requires 6 kilometres of irrigation canals and another 36 kilometres of large and small drains. Even the capital city, Georgetown, is below sea level and depends on dikes for protection. The main feature of Guyana, of course, is the rainforest. Forest covers around 80% of the country, the vast majority of it still classified as pristine. It is third in the world on the Index of Forest Landscape Integrity, which you can see on this map, with the green parts having essentially zero measurable human modification. Parts have never been properly charted. There's only one road through the jungle, and that was only built recently. In fact, according to the CIA World Factbook, as of 2019, Guyana had only 799 kilometers of paved roads. And in this wild country, you have jaguars, tapir, and sloths. You have arapaima, the world's largest scaled freshwater fish, the world's largest anteater, and the world's largest otter as well. As you can guess, Guyana is hot and muggy, without much interruption. In Georgetown, the average high in the hottest month is 32 degrees and 29 in the coldest. In all of Guyana, the hottest temperature ever recorded was only 34 degrees and the coldest 20. Humidity is 70%, year-round. So what about Guyana's people? Today, Guyana is about 40% Indo-Guyanese, the descendants of those indentured servants brought there by the British. That number has actually dropped back from independence when they were over half the population. Next come Afro-Guyanese at around 30%, mixed-race people roughly 20%, and Amerindians 10%. The Amerindians used to be 100%, of course, but experienced a population crash after the arrival of Europeans. By 1900, there were only around 18,000 indigenous Guyanese left. Those that survived had done so because of their isolation, pushed into the economic periphery of the jungle. Their population has, however, started to recover, and they are the fastest growing group in Guyana. They are split into 9 tribes: the Waiwai, Makushi, Patamona, Lokono, Kalina, Wapishana, Pemon, Akawayo, and Warao. Many of their territories straddle international borders. Each has their own customs and language, though some are closely related. However, I was told by Amerindians I met during my travels in Guyana that because of intermarriage, these tribal divisions are lessening, and because many of these marriages are across language lines, the language of communication between, say, a Makushi and a Wapishana is often English. Guyana is the only country in South America where English is the official language. It's not what most people speak as a first language, though, which is Guyanese Creole. It's similar to other English Caribbean Creoles, and spiced with West African, Indian, Arawakan, and Dutch. In many ways, Guyana is culturally Caribbean, and it feels like that if you walk around Georgetown. The most popular music is calypso, and its various offshoots like reggae, chutney, and soca, and its common food includes dal, roti, and cook-up rice.
Guyana smiling again, Guyana moving again. Get going, Guyana, your future looking so much brighter. Keep moving, Guyana, and don't make nobody rump up your bike.
But it's also not like the rest of the Caribbean because of its extensive rainforest and Amerindian population. The closest analogue to Guyana, of course, is neighbouring Suriname, which also has a large population descended from African slaves, as well as Indian indentured servants. Unlike Suriname, though, Guyana doesn't have many Javanese, nor Maroons, the groups of people living in the interior whose ancestors escaped from plantations hundreds of years ago. So it is fair, I think, to say that there's nowhere else in the world quite like Guyana. Before we take a look at its politics and its trajectory, what does it actually feel like today? For this, we're going to take a look around Georgetown, the capital of Guyana.
Morning in Georgetown. The day starts and the people are walking to work. At high tide, the sea is 5 feet higher than the city. Its soul, you could say, is still Dutch. For well over half its colonial existence, Guyana was Dutch, and this town was called Stabroek. A few hours later, and the city has started to bustle. In Guyana, the grass always needs cutting. In the city centre is St. George's Cathedral, made entirely of wood. The cathedral is supposed to be the tallest wooden building in the world, which is a funny decision because wood, or any other material in Guyana, doesn't usually last long. Georgetown has an outstanding collection of signs. In Georgetown, it feels like everyone is hustling all the time. Colourful taxi vans zoom around town, ready to race at the lights. Seeing drunk people is a common sight in the capital. I find a tamarind tree and a friendly woman who shows me how to eat it.
This is how you know it's dried.
Okay.
You see it's that whole, but then when you make so, it goes right in.
Ah, cool.
And then you just crack it open. This here is what you eat. Then you can loose them up,
Yeah.
coat them with sugar, and make tamarind balls.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
If you want a couple more, you can get a couple more.
Down on the waterfront, some Hindus place flowers and candles on banana leaves and send them out to sea in prayer. It often rains in Georgetown, and I find somewhere to escape the weather. At the National Museum, you're only allowed to take selfies. That's literally a rule. Outside, it's turned into a lovely day. The best place to check out the bustle of Georgetown is at Starbrook Market, though I was warned it really isn't safe. A local friend told me of someone they knew who was held up there at knife point, in the middle of the day. After the market, I head down to Regent Street, the centre of everything in Georgetown. One evening, I ate barbecue cooked for me by some Venezuelans on a street corner. Around 30,000 Venezuelans have moved to Guyana in the past few years since their economy has imploded. I was told much of Georgetown isn't safe after dark, and that was certainly true in the first neighbourhood that I stayed in. Given that in the tropics it's dark by 7, it meant I got some nice early nights.
So let's talk about how the present-day Guyana was formed. Well, we talked about Guyana's different groups, and since independence, ethnicity has entirely determined the country's politics. The two big players here are the PPP, mainly representing Indo-Guyanese, and the PNC, mainly representing Afro-Guyanese. Between independence in 1966 and 1985, Guyana was ruled by Lyndon Forbes Burnham. who was the subject of the previous video in the series. As well as extravagantly leaning into the identity of Guyana as an African country, involving himself in revolutionary movements in Africa, he also largely ran the state on behalf of Afro-Guyanese. Then he died. It wasn't until 1992 that Guyana had an election that was internationally recognized as being free and fair. Indo-Guyanese, though their proportion of the population had dropped slightly since independence, were still comfortably the biggest group, and now the PPP came to power. It was their turn to be in charge, and they would run the country for another 20 years. The PPP set about dismantling Burnham's state control of the economy and most of his authoritarianism. Their leader was Chedi Jagan, who had been Burnham's rival from way back in the 1950s. His parents were born in India, and he had studied to be a dentist in the United States, where he met Janet Rosenberg, a dental hygienist and communist who became his wife. The presence of these two titanic figures, Jagan and Burnham, in Guyana's history is everywhere. The international airport, for example, is named after Chedi Jagan, while Guyana's second biggest city is named after Burnham. Jagan died in 1997 and was replaced by his wife Janet, who had served as his hygienist as he worked for all those years as a dentist in Georgetown, in the political wilderness. So a Jewish American communist was now leading this tiny South American country as head of a party representing people mostly descended from India, only in Guyana. So Indo-Guyanese parties kept winning elections until 2015, when the PNC got back into power. For many Afro-Guyanese, this 23-year period from 1992 to 2015 is remembered as being both corrupt and a time when the Indo-Guyanese lorded it over them. Of course, many Indo-Guyanese would say the same about the previous period, living under the PNC. This racial division of its politics has been a massive constraint on Guyana's development. Fundamentally, Guyana has weak institutions. The massive immigration we've talked about in previous videos certainly doesn't help. What Guyana seems to need is a new political culture. But then, so do lots of countries.
If you vote for Biden, it means no kids in school.
Trump is a convicted felon.
No Christmas.
Trying to hide hush money payments to a porn star.
If you don't like it, you're perfectly entitled to your view. I couldn't give a flying flamingo what your view is.
This is where there is hope. Guyana isn't the same place that it was 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago. This is because of two groups in particular. While Afro-Guyanese are around 30% of the population and Indo-Guyanese 40%, the numbers of mixed race and indigenous voters are both increasing, and so a spread of third parties are now entering the equation, trying to block the duopoly. And in my conversations with people in Guyana, there is certainly an appetite for a post-racial politics. After 60 years of racialized rule, things perhaps are beginning to change. And they need to change, because Guyana has a lot to sort out. It is 108th in the world in the UNDP's Human Development Index. In terms of life expectancy, the World Bank puts it at 154th in the world, below Gabon and Eritrea, and it has the highest maternal mortality rate in South America. As of 2020, 2/5 of the population live below the poverty line, earning less than $5.50 a day. The education system is so bad that children make 7 years worth of progress in the 12 they spend at school. Around 4/5 of university graduates leave Guyana after graduating, and so the Guyanese diaspora is nearly as large as the country's current population. Even worse, its suicide rate is 4 times the world average, until very recently the highest in the entire world. That statistic actually hides something even darker. 80% of these suicides are by Indo-Guyanese, mostly men living in rural areas. This is something that seems to be common throughout the Indian diaspora worldwide, and we don't really know why. Illegal logging and wildcat gold mining are endemic, and beyond that, crime has become a massive problem. In 2002, New York, a hub for Guyanese in the United States, deported all its Guyanese criminals. Crime surged. Now Guyana's crime rate is almost triple the world average, with the world's 20th highest homicide rate. I spent a fair bit of time in Georgetown, as well as the rest of Guyana, and honestly, I found it to be one of the most dangerous places I've ever visited. I got warning after warning about walking around alone, and this was during the day and from locals, not scared foreigners. It's undoubtedly safer outside of the capital, but in my experience in Guyana, that sense of insecurity exists through most of the country. Guyana's economy is reliant on farming rice and sugar, as well as mining and timber. 400 years after Europeans arrived, and it's still an extractive economy, not a recipe for long-term sustainable growth. But the big decision facing the government, of course, is what to do about the oil. Because in 2015, after decades of fruitless searching, they finally found it. Exxonmobil thinks 11 billion barrels can be pumped out of Guyana's waters, putting its reserves in the world's top 20, in a country of some 800,000 people. It is the largest single addition to the world's oil reserves made in the past 50 years. Oil can, however, be a problem because of something called Dutch disease. A massive and sudden influx of wealth into an economy pushes up the value of the currency, which makes that country's exports more expensive. Fewer exports mean people lose their jobs, and the wider economy can get hollowed out. To avoid this, it is now standard practice for countries to keep their resource wealth in a sovereign wealth fund, which is denominated in a foreign currency. For this reason, Guyana set up an offshore fund for the oil money to go into, to be injected gradually and sensibly into the economy, with strict limits on how much any particular government could take out. And this brings us to where we are today. This growing pile of cash was the prize at stake in the 2020 election, the first one since the oil began to flow. In the election, foreign observers said the vote counting had lacked credibility and transparency. Western diplomats called it a fraud. Guyana's Chief Justice stopped the Elections Commission from announcing the result. Weeks went by without anyone knowing what was going on. Outsiders believed Granger, the incumbent president of the PNC, lost, but it looked like he wasn't going to walk away. Eventually, after 5 months of litigation, and after pressure from the US, UK, and Caribbean community, a recount showed that the PPP, the opposition, had won, but only by 2 seats. Now, in their election campaign, the PPP had said it wanted to get rid of the sovereign wealth fund completely, and hand the money directly to the politicians to decide how to use it. Given the PPP's thoroughly corrupt reputation during their 23 years in power, this seems problematic. As recently as 2019, Guyana was South America's second poorest country after Bolivia. By 2022, in dollar terms, it was the second richest. I should say that these days, since the oil started to flow, talking about Guyana's economy is kind of weird because there's this huge mismatch between its economy on paper and its economy on the ground level. For example, in 2020, the Guyanese economy grew by a scarcely believable 49%, and that was during the pandemic when the rest of the world was coming apart. But that growth number really doesn't describe the experience of most Guyanese, for whom life continues much as before. By 2024, Exxonmobil hopes to be pumping 750,000 barrels a day. By 2028, that should reach 1.2 million. It even emits less than half the CO2 per barrel than the global average. So, as regulations on carbon emissions tighten, it should actually get more desirable in the world market. By 2030, Guyana will probably be one of the world's largest oil producers per capita, and the revenues the government gets from it will be around double the size of the entire economy before the oil started to flow. The mostly Indo-Guyanese PPP now hold the reins of power, and their 22 years in power before 2015 are remembered for corruption. The PNC's 28 years in power before that were just as bad. Now, to their credit, the PPP has, since their election in 2020, actually tightened the rules around the Sovereign Wealth Fund, making it easier for citizens to track how much should be in it. But according to the Economist Intelligence Unit and others, Guyana is still a flawed democracy. The APNU, a mainly Afro-Guyanese coalition that includes the PNC, has already accused the government of directing oil money towards Indo-Guyanese and away from Afro-Guyanese. On the other hand, the oil money is undoubtedly going to do some good. Guyana is building its first deepwater port, which will, without doubt, help the wider economy, as well as hospitals and schools. Ironically enough, some of the most urgent infrastructure funded by oil is to defend itself against the impacts of climate change and rising sea levels. And of course, this model of a sovereign wealth fund really can work. Look at Norway with its $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, which supports one of the most generous social safety nets in the world, and will do for a very, very long time. So what will Guyana look like in 10 years? Will it be Dubai or Venezuela? As an article in the Harvard International Review put it, no number of concerns can negate the reality that Guyana has won the oil lottery, and with it the potential to lift its people out of poverty. The promise of a golden Guyana remains. The government just has to take the necessary precautions to realize it.
In this country, It's my lyrical duty to make Guyanese understand how to live in an oil-rich land. We got gold, bauxite and diamond, yet we're the poorest in the Caribbean. Well, if we people not start unite, foreign investors go sharp we as they like. Well, if we want to enjoy the sweet of this country, we got to be in love and unity. For a better future, for we family, we got to be in love and unity. So let me tell you, let us live as one, my people. Come, let's unite, yeah. Let us unite as one for the future generation.
On our last day in Guyana, my travelling companion Dan and I had woken up in the beanab of our friend Adam, who sent us off with some mangoes. We were heading towards the Brazil border. Our first ride was a long time coming, so when it came, we were very grateful. Our first ride left us most of the way to Lethem. The problem was that there was almost no traffic. All we could do was wait and eat our mangoes.
There's some fearsome looking wasps.
We had been waiting hours and it was late afternoon. We were starting to get desperate. Finally, we spotted another pickup truck. What followed was the scariest ride of my entire life. We were literally hanging onto the metal box on the back by our fingertips. It's not an exaggeration to say that it was a near-death experience.
Oh my god, I can't believe we just arrived. That is the scariest thing I've ever done.
That night, after a shower and some time to collect ourselves, we went into town for some food. Lethem is the largest town in all of southern Guyana. Apparently with a population of only a couple of thousand people. It's the gateway to Brazil, and there are plenty of restaurants with Brazilian food, but especially massive outlet stores run by Chinese, where the prices are in Brazilian reais. Apparently it's cheaper for Brazilians to cross the border to shop in warehouses of goods shipped from China and then through the Guyanese rainforest than in Brazil, because of its high tariffs. We walked down to the river that marks the border with Brazil, and it was time for some reflections on Guyana.
So Guyana, overall, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we had a couple big themes that we talked about a lot, one of which was kind of the sense of identity, or lack of identity.
What does it mean to be Guyanese? I've heard a few different things, right? Like, Guyana is divided by ethnicity, but by all accounts it's becoming less and less true. A lot of people said that's only at election time. It seems like certainly outside of Georgetown and what they call the hinterland, people of the different groups, Amerindian, Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, mixed race, they seem to mix pretty freely. It does not seem like there are deep divisions there.
Not at all. So the Creole is a really beautiful unifying thing. Most people here don't seem to think of their language as a language. They always said they speak broken English, which of course is, as far as we know, not true. It's a fully developed language and really fun to listen to. Completely incomprehensible to us when people are talking to each other in that full Creole. And it's so cool to see so many different types of people speaking that same language.
The consensus amongst linguists is that it is its own language and it's something that they can be proud of, and it's spoken by Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, Amerindians.
Another thing that was striking, and we kind of knew ahead of time but didn't know what it would mean on the ground, is the sense of being a Caribbean country. The distance from the interior, the Brazilian border here to the coast is like a It feels like another planet. So the connection to the Caribbean is much, much stronger. A lot of people, it seemed like, had been to Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados. They speak a very, I mean, to our ears, it sounds like a very similar kind of accent and way of speaking to the Caribbean.
Another thing that we discovered coming through here is just how focused on extractive industries the interior is, especially mining and forestry.
We didn't see really any other industry. There's very, very little tourism. So yeah, it seems to be mostly aluminum, bauxite mining, and gold mining, or forestry, and most people seem to work in those industries.
And it really feels, because it's like very male-dominated and kind of lawless out here, it really has that feeling of kind of the classic Wild West.
That might be true more in these kind of new towns that have sprung up to support those industries, and less true in the Amerindian villages, which probably don't have that male-dominated frontier vibe.
Speaking of the Amerindian communities that we've kind of glimpsed, it's one thing that's like visible immediately is just how prevalent alcohol is in those communities. It's very, very common to see people drinking from early on in the day. There doesn't seem to be any or very little acknowledgement that that might be in some way problematic. There's lots of drinking with kids around.
I think in a lot of ways it's a common problem where what used to be a traditional practice that was moored in like strong customs became unmoored from those customs. So I think people did traditionally, like in many cultures, drink some kind of alcoholic drink for breakfast or lunch. But it became kind of unmoored as people lost the kind of rhythm of their daily lives.
So to summarize, Guyana, absolutely stunning country in terms of environmental beauty. Overall, I would say quite a challenging country to travel in. There's no way to ignore the fact that it is unbelievably expensive.
Yeah, even for us it was expensive, and we're just completely baffled how the average person here can afford to even take a local bus.
It's hard to figure out how they function when a bus can cost $80 from one end of the country to the other, yet most of the houses that you see along the way don't have electricity.
A difficult country to travel, but a beautiful country, naturally incredibly beautiful, incredibly diverse and friendly people, at least outside of Georgetown.
So this series has taken us through the entire history of Guyana. We've visited the Essequibo region, Bartica, we've gone around Georgetown, we've gone south through the jungle to the Rupununi. Now we're going to go down here to the border, we're going to cross into Brazil, and in the next video we're going to start looking at the story of the Amazon rainforest.